Good evening. My name is Joshua Chuang. I'm the Associate Director of the Wallach Division of Art, Prints, and Photographs here at the New York Public Library. And it's my pleasure to welcome you tonight to the library and also to introduce our featured speakers. In introduction, I'd like to keep rather crisp because I'd like to leave as much time as possible for what I think will be a really fascinating conversation. Jed Perl is an art critic whose writing regularly appears in the New York Review of Books. And for 20 years, he was the art critic for the New Republic, starting in 1994. Atlantic magazine observed that he may, quote, be the finest art critic at work today in any field. No small feat. Something that might be partially attributed to the fact that he began as a painter, and maybe a little bit to the fact that his father was a Nobel Prize-winning physicist. He's written many books, including Magicians and Charlatans, Essays on Art and Culture, which collects a lot of his writing for the New Republic, Antoine's Alphabet, Watteau and His World, and New Art City, Manhattan at Mid-Century. He's here tonight to talk about his newest book, Alexander Calder, The Conquest of Time, for which he received a Guggenheim Fellowship and a fellowship from the Leon Levy Center for Biography at CUNY. He's going to be in conversation with Sandy Rower, who was president and co-founder in 1987 of the Alexander Calder Foundation, which is dedicated to collecting, exhibiting, preserving, and interpreting the art and archives of Alexander Calder, who was Sandy's grandfather. There's going to be, the conversation is going to run for about 45 minutes, and there will be time afterwards for questions, a Q&A from the audience. And I just wanted to emphasize that the book is for sale on a table outside of the auditorium. Sales go towards supporting the mission of the library. And there will also, Jed will also be happy to sign your book afterwards if you please. I'd also like to make a plug for the library and for any of you who aren't yet card-carrying members of the library to do so. It's very, very easy, and you get a lot of benefits. It's free. And that's also very easy to do online or here in person at the library. So without further ado, let's welcome Jed Perl and Sandy Rower.
Really? Seems like we know everybody here.
Yeah, everybody in the front row, absolutely.
Good evening. Jed and I like to talk about his book.
Okay.
We sort of ramble on about different things, and you're going to get many minutes at the end to ask us questions, so write them down. They're going to be, I'm sure, a whole long list of questions. Where do you want to begin?
Why does this biography exist?
Jean-Paul Sartre is here tonight. What's that? Oh, she can't hear. Oh, Jed.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Why does this biography exist?
But what do you mean by that?
Well, there are several senses.
Like, who made the paper?
It was printed in Germany, you know.
Yeah. Fancy.
Well, first of all, sometimes people are surprised that there hasn't been a biography of Calder, who died in 1976. So it's been over 40 years with no biography. He himself told an autobiography to his son-in-law, a book called An Autobiography with Pictures, published in the 60s. But there has been no biography, so people sometimes wonder about that.
So Jed's trying to get at what a bastard I am. Let's just cut right to the chase. So I began the Calder Foundation now actually literally 30 years ago, November in 1987. And I was incredibly frustrated about certain notions about my grandfather and attitudes about who he was and all these total weird misconceptions and so forth. And so once in a while, a biographer would come to me and say, I'd love to have access to the Calder Foundation archives to research for a biography. And this happened, literally, I've counted it 15 times over these years that Jed's talking about. One particular illustrious biographer who'd written many, many biographies, I said to her, well, why now? And she said, well, in 18 months, there's an exhibition opening. I've got to get the biography out. And so, that was just, get rid of that person. That was terrible. But she's famous as a biographer, but I couldn't participate. I said, go write a biography, but we can't participate. So when Jed walked through our door, it was like a shining light, and there was a sword and a stone. There was a lightning struck, right? He pulled the sword right out of that stone.
Well, it's funny because when I met Sandy, he had on his desk, his George Nakashima desk, I might add, an essay I'd written a decade before in the New Republic called Being Geniuses Together, when the great centennial show which you helped organize of your grandfather's work was at the National Gallery, Washington. And simultaneously at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, there were shows of Alvar Aalto, the architect, and Fernand Léger, the painter. And at the New Republic, I used to enjoy putting things together. And I thought these three things seem to go together. And then I started to work on this essay, and I realized that these three men had been great friends. And when we met, you said, how did I know this? And I said, well, I went to the library. But there's a bigger point here. But there's a bigger point here, which is, I think what appealed to you about that essay was that I was putting Calder in a context of other key modern figures and kind of creating what historians now call a network, or beginning to create a network. And one of the enigmas of Calder, and I've realized this, Sandy's always telling me, people don't understand my grandfather and they think he was just playing and he made toys, and you express a lot of frustration about that. And one of the things I've realized as this book has appeared in public in the last month, and there have been a lot of reviews, is reviewers do seem to have a lot of trouble locating this enormously famous artist. Nobody's saying Calder isn't famous, but people seem to have a lot of trouble locating him in the broader story of 20th century art. And I guess this has made me realize that one of the central things that I've been trying to do, and it's really, I think, one of the things that brought us together, although I didn't fully realize it at the beginning, is this sort of mission of trying to rethink the history of 20th century art in a more fluid and capacious way, perhaps. So it's not, there's sort of the Clement Greenberg view of sculpture that Gonzalez and Picasso do these sculptures that beget David Smith, which begets Anthony Cairo, and that's sort of it, that's the story. And there tend to be these very simple-minded stories that art historians and then curators and the more general public kind of glom onto. And Calder, although enormously famous, he doesn't really fit into any of these stories. And I think that's part of the great challenge of telling this life, of finding a way to put Calder at the center of the modern story, which really hasn't been done before. A friend of mine, an old friend, a poet, who's reading the biography, wrote to me and said, you've made Calder a kind of magnetic center for modernism. And I think in a way that's what I was trying to do. Not say he's the only center, but suggest, I've always thought there are many different kind of centers and sub-centers in this story. And to argue that he's a major one with all these things kind of flowing out of him and back to him, I think was part of the ambition here. And I think in a way we both knew that was what we were trying to do when we started, even though we didn't really know each other at that point.
We had a rough beginning, it's true.
We did?
Yeah, it was so rocky. That was a joke. But that's one of the strange things, is that all these dozens and dozens of reviewers have, a few of them have criticized you because you're telling stories upon stories upon stories. You're telling stories about people who never knew Calder. And what's the point of that?
Only once or twice.
Yeah, but even just those couple.
Yeah.
And what I find so tremendously rich, I mean, this is a man I've studied most of my life, and a story I've studied most of my life, and you've brought so much more detail to me, someone who knows the subject. It's been so rewarding to get to know Calder so much better through your work, through your research, and the way you write, how you draw us in.
And I've had you, thank God, as my bullshit detector.
Yeah, that's true. I did push the button a few times.
If an argument is okay with him, then I figure it's okay. Sometimes I've come up with these kind of connections and theories. I think, though, this is cool but implausible. And I'll email Sandy at like 11 at night and say, Sandy's going to say, this is crazy. And then you say, yeah. I'm like, gee. He has a very exacting imagination. He likes to kind of take things apart piece by piece.
And it's more like 3 a.m. that he emails me, not 11 p.m., first of all. And I usually reply by 3:05. No, we've had great fun.
We have.
I mean, I didn't write this book in any regard. I just sat back and watched him go through our incredibly extensive, we have 130,000 documents in the Calder Foundation archive.
It's an amazing.
And Jed has read many, many of the letters there, certainly the family letters, the tie-ins, the friends. Anybody who was researching read everything there was.
Calder, your grandfather, and everybody else in the family, these people kept everything. I really don't, even in the late 20s and early 30s, when your grandfather was in his early 30s, basically, and going back and forth between New York and France every 6 months or a year, there are pharmacy receipts from the south of France belonging to friends of Calder's that are in the Calder archive. Like, there's this, I'm looking at this pharmacy receipts from 1927, San Rafael. I'm thinking, that doesn't look like. And then I realized the name on it is Hayter. I think, my God, that's the printmaker Stanley William Hayter, was an early friend. So he went to the pharmacy to get something, and your grandfather kept the receipt, and there it is, 90 years later.
And I still kept it.
And you kept it.
Yeah.
I mean, the first years I was working on this, it was terrifying. I mean, because the stuff keeps coming and coming at you.
Jed would ask about somebody, and he'd say, oh yeah, we have volumes on, so he'd really get into it.
And the other thing with Calder is because Calder had this gift for friendship and loved parties. In the first years I was working on this, people in New York would come up to me and say, oh, call me. I have some great stories about Calder. And so I'd call these people. And in the first few years, I had no idea whether something was significant or totally trivial. By now, if somebody tells me an anecdote, most of them I've heard that anecdote 30 times before, but every once in a while there's something unusual. But the first years, I was just kind of barely dog paddling, and you would swan by as I'm sitting there reading. You say, "What do you think?" And I would say, "I have absolutely no idea." But after a few years,
I would swan by. Did you get that? That was great. Swan by.
Anyway,
there was more ducking than swan. So I'm going to give you 2 examples of the archival materials. So we keep a chronology, a life chronology, every single day of Calder's life that we know something about. We make an entry. We know the date that he changed houses after he married my grandmother, and they went back to Paris together in beginning of 31, in January 31. They changed houses. We know the day because we have the handwritten single little piece of paper, the taxi receipt from them transferring from one house to the next, and how many bags and boxes and so forth. And they just kept it, and so we happen to know that specific date, which is really fascinating. This wonderful woman, Heston Clapp, who was a young woman, she's still alive. She was the neighbor's daughter in Connecticut. And my grandfather really liked her too, this little girl, but was friends with her parents, obviously, and they were younger than my grandparents. And my grandfather wrote her a few letters directly to Heston herself as a girl. And many years ago, Heston came to visit me at the foundation to deliver these letters, to donate them to the archives, which was really beautiful. And I brought her back into where the archives are, we have 5 archivists, 6 now actually, that work full-time on the archive. And I wanted her to see how the letters would be kept in sleeves and a binder, and how they'd be cared for all eternity and so forth. And one of my employees was sorting receipts in a big receipt folder, just receipts from all different things of Calder's life. And right on top was a receipt for saddlebags, you know, those bags on a horse you keep stuff in. What do we need a receipt for saddlebags? We don't need a receipt for saddlebags. Who cares about saddlebags? But we kept this receipt over the years, and it was still there in the receipt. It was right on top. And I went to the wall in this whole wall of binders with all this correspondence, and I pulled out one, literally, you won't believe me, but literally at random, I pulled this binder out, and it was letters with Keith and Edna Warner, who had commissioned a bunch of work, and I opened it, and it was a letter in the 50s, and it's a letter to Keith from my grandfather, and it says, "Dear Keith, I just bought Louisa saddlebags to use as a purse." And I was stunned because it was a remarkable circumstance.
Now, isn't Warner the one who made gloves? Is he the guy who made gloves? Is Warner the guy?
No, what gloves?
Who's the guy who had a factory making gloves?
He did have a couple of factories. I don't know about the gloves.
I think he made gloves.
He might have made gloves. Anyway, so every single little piece of paper we keep, because somehow it's a clue. Sometimes it turns out to be very significant. The saddlebags weren't that significant, but it was shocking to see them relate.
But I mean, one of the challenges as a biographer then is, what do you do with all of this? Yeah. And some of it should sink to the bottom and not end up in a biography. And I think you have in the program was told this little, I was asked to give a sort of bibliography, offer a bibliography. The bibliography I gave, it consists not of books about the visual arts. This is a bibliography I originally did for a bookstore, the bookstore at the University of Chicago, and they asked me to do a sort of bibliography associated with what I've done here. And what I suggested as suggested reading for people were some of what I regard as the great biographies of creative spirits, Richard Ellman's biographies of James Joyce and Oscar Wilde. And then I mentioned that one of the things that was really important for me in writing this biography was memoirs. So for instance, John Dos Passos, the wonderful novelist who was a friend, not a close friend, but a bit of a friend of the Calders, he wrote a book called The Best of Times about his early years in Paris in America, which, although he and Calder weren't friends at that point, but they're running on parallel tracks. And one of the things I found so important about looking beyond the visual arts to literary and other sources was to try to locate Calder and all this, and Calder's art and all this information you have at the foundation in some larger canvas. How do you do that? How do you write about a creative spirit? How do you tell the story of the life, have the narrative of the life? And there are parts of Calder's life that I think are thrilling as narrative. When he falls in love in 1929, when he's is he yet on the boat, the Gras, he's just turning 31. Yeah, just turning 31. And he meets a woman about 5 years younger, Louisa James, a great niece of Henry James, from a sort of idiosyncratic Boston Brahmin family. And they have this great romance and this great marriage for 45 years. So there's that element. You want to tell those kind of stories, but you also, or at least I want to, in a biography of an artist, sometimes slow down the narrative to really meditate on the work, which a lot of biographers don't seem to be that interested in doing. So there's a kind of writerly question of how do you put these things together, and how do you move from the narrative of life to the story of the art and back, and how do you flow those together, and when do they converge and when do they diverge? Because I think one of the other things I certainly have always felt is I think we're all made out of different pieces. I don't think people are just one thing, one kind of total personality and sense of the world. I think we have different elements and aspects in ourselves. And I think in our private lives, in our public lives, in our creative lives, we may represent variegated, though interwoven strands of who we are. And I think one of the things people have sometimes found surprising about this biography is that I don't argue that it's all one thing. Calder is an artist who is always associated with play, with the amusing aspects, with charm, with delight, with those aspects of art. But Calder was also a man and an artist capable of enormous gravitas. And one of the aspects of his work that I really land on quite heavily in this volume is his theatrical work, where you see that coming out, especially when he is commissioned in 1936, to do a setting, a visual setting, for a performance at the Wadsworth Athenaeum of Eric Satie's sort of chamber opera, Socrate, which is about the death of Socrates. And Virgil Thomson, the great composer, and somebody who moved in the same circles as Calder in Paris, Virgil Thomson goes to Calder, the playful, amusing joker, for a setting for what is one of the most severe and in its way dark pieces of music composed in the early years of the 20th century. And it was composed in sort of amidst World War I, at the end of toward the end of World War I, and then in 1936 it's being performed in Hartford at a point where everybody in Calder's world is conscious of the rise of authoritarianism, both on the right and the left in Europe. And here's this opera about the death of a man who believed in freedom, in the freedom of the mind. And Calder is the one who designs this incredibly austere setting for it. So I think it's really been important to emphasize that side of Calder, which doesn't deny the play. You know, I find that people want an artist to be one way or the other. We were talking about this the other day. I mean, people want, Picasso is a misogynist. So the fact that he painted women sometimes with great sensitivity and psychological depth, they don't want to entertain the fact that he could be both of those things. And I think with your grandfather, people find it hard to accept the largeness and the variegated nature of the achievement.
But those people are the same people who believe the definition of biography is salacious sex stories knitted together. That's what it is. I mean, some people are upset that there's no sex in this book, or very little. Okay, there's a little bit, but
I've done what I can.
Yeah. He's teased out whatever he could. But no, seriously, there was a person was talking about how it can't be a good biography because there's no sex story, which is astonishing to me that somebody would actually say that.
Well,
it doesn't surprise you. You're an old hand, but
yeah. Well, and I mean, one of the wonderful things about doing this was I've been working on this for 9 years, and at a certain point.
I like how he checked his watch.
Well, I just
after
don't,
he said
would want to
that.
leave
9
people a
years
lot of time
and
for questions.
18 seconds.
Yeah, right. 9 years and 12 minutes and 4 seconds. One of the wonderful things that happened at some point in the middle of the process, I would say, 5 years in or something, was I began to have some kind of a sixth sense or something about your grandfather. And like, when he was telling, either in his own autobiography or in some interview, when he was sort of telling tall tales and bullshitting us. And when he would say something and I would say, aha, okay, you're speaking to me now. And I began to have the feeling that even if I was sitting at dinner with him, and I never met him, although I probably could have, we would be drinking, and I love to drink as he loved to drink. But I began to have the feeling that we would kind of, that he wouldn't have let on that much because he didn't like to let on that much to anybody. I mean, he kind of, if you were a smart dude who was maybe writing about art, he was like, okay, you go do your thing, and I'm going to do my thing, and I'm expecting you to, do what you do honorably. But I began to have this feeling that we would kind of get each other, and that I kind of got what was going on. And that's what, in fact, enabled me to sort of, and it was actually in the later part of working on the book, it was when we were even in page proofs, some of these dalliances he had with women in the 5 or so years before he married your grandmother, I began to see deeper into them, I believe. And I always tried to write with when you're not quite sure about something, but you want to kind of say it when you're writing a biography, how do you do that? And I kind of decided what you have to do is write it in such a way that people get the drift of what you're saying, but if more evidence comes up, it won't contradict what you say. In other words, it may take the story in this direction or that direction, but it won't contradict what you've established. That's kind of what I tried to do. But there was a nice feeling I got into in the last couple of years that I was sort of in sync with your grandfather in a way, which I certainly didn't feel in the early years.
I saw that happen, and you're right, it was around year five or six, because Jed used to ask me these questions, and I'd always have a snappy answer for one of his questions about something that happened. And then around 5 or 6 years, he'd ask me a question, I go, that's a great question, let's try and figure it out. And so that's when I recognized you'd really gotten in there to the degree that you could, start to educate everyone.
Right. Well, and then I would start to ask questions where you would have an answer, and then I would have a question to your answer.
Yeah.
Like about the dating of the Josephine Baker. There's this great wire sculpture of Josephine Baker. One of them has for years been dated 1926. The Calder arrived in Paris in the summer of 26, and this date goes back to his 1943 retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art, and it's always been that way. And I had accepted it for years, and then I'm in the process of really thrashing out, rewriting the early Paris chapters, and I'm realizing every other wire sculpture is dated 27, 28, 29, and there are various stories about how Calder moved from the first things he did, where he used wire and cloth and other stuff, and then he moves into pure wire. And I'm just thinking, it can't be. It's not, 26 doesn't make any sense. And then I started to inquire with you guys and with Susan. Is Susan Dan here? Susan, I have to give a shout out to, who is the head of research. Is that her title?
She's Director of Research and Publication.
Director of Research and Publication. And Susan is the great scholar on Calder, and we have these insane conversations sometimes where everybody else would think we're like on acid or something. We're talking about these things. So I started to press on this, and then it turns out, well, 26 is kind of, there's actually no evidence from 26 or 20, so it's a later thing. And so
there's no evidence that it's from 26.
Right.
There's no evidence it's from 27.
Right.
And it's always been dated 1926, not circa 26, but definitive date by Calder as early as 1943 moment. And this is the kind of intricacy we get into that nobody else gives a shit about.
We seem like lunatics, right?
But if you're going to speculate that Josephine Baker, the first of the 5 images of Josephine Baker, was made later than 26, then I can speculate that he didn't screw those women that you're speculating about too.
But you know what? I said to him, I finally said, I have to talk about it. It's not 26. I now know in my heart it's not. So, by God, in the book, it says circa 1926, right? So, Sandy finally said, look, Jed, we can't change it from 26 to 27 right like that. It's been 26 since 1943.
Well, we need more than a hunch.
Right.
You have a great hunch, and I respect your hunch.
Sure, but it's more than a hunch.
And you could be
I'm
sure.
convinced the way you're convinced of certain.
But I actually believe that his quick route from arriving in Paris and then making his circus, which is what he focused on for most of those months, and going to drawing classes, whatever, but that his route to the formal wire sculpture, the first one, the first 2 or 3, could easily have been within a month. It doesn't have to be in 27.
We agree that his grandfather's a genius, but he kind of thinks he's, I don't know, a kind of genius to the zonked nth degree or something. I think even with his genius, it took he wasn't even settled until August, for God's sake. So it's September, October.
No, the book is already printed.
It's 1927.
But we're still discussing this.
But it's, and it seems very pedantic, and it is, but it grows out of something
No, it's
bigger.
not that pedantic, because at the same time, there are man-ray photographs of Jean Cocteau holding a wire head, a wire
but that's
portrait,
just wrong.
which have been dated as early as 1924, which are totally incorrect. And Susan over there went to great labor and research to figure out that that sitting was actually 1929. And definitively 29, there's no doubt that they're
But
1929.
actually, the other thing about some of these things, like Cocteau and Calder, at the Calder Foundation, there's always been this annoyance that Cocteau is credited with things that Calder should actually be credited with. For instance, and another example, at the Calder Foundation, there's always been this annoyance with Tom Wolfe's representation of Calder as the artist Piggy Logan in the posthumously published novel You Can't Go Home Again, where Calder's represented as this kind of effete representative of the spirit of the 1920s. But one of the things looking at these things, sometimes things that piss you off in a way, if you look at them from another direction, they're really, really interesting. So the fact is, Cocteau was fascinated by your grandfather practically from the minute your grandfather arrived in Paris. Now that's interesting.
But he tried to absorb him.
Right, but that's interesting because Cocteau was also one of the great talent scouts of the 20th century. And the Thomas Wolfe thing, which makes you guys in the family, and it's funny, the family's still like, ugh, you're reading the Tom Wolfe biography novel, they're all like repelled by it because their grandpa's made into this kind of fool. But then you look at it in another way, and it actually, when you think of Tom Wolfe, this sort of engagé, swaggering 30s, kind of pontificating leftist, and then you think of your grandfather, who was in fact a kind of very serious liberal aesthete, I would say, then you can actually, you learn things about Calder by seeing how Wolfe reacted to him, because these are two men with very different reactions to the transformation from the Roaring '20s to the Depression in the 30s.
Well, I love the way you treat that moment in the book and how you explain who Tom Wolfe is really trying to get even with in his description. And it's not to challenge Calder even, who's Calder. It's to challenge that times, the 20s, and the way you write about it, I think, is really, and it's part of that this style of your writing that some people don't like, which is you're telling a story about stories to explain the whole milieu, which is exciting.
I mean, one of the, and we should open it up to questions in a minute, but I mean, one of the things I've sort of tried to do is look at the many interlocking explanations for the workings of a great imagination, the imagination of a genius. And when you come to Calder's move at the very beginning of the 30s into abstraction, the thing Calder always talked about was this revelatory visit to Mondrian's studio in the fall of 1930. And indeed, Calder, who was almost the opposite of a hero worshiper, Mondrian is the one person of whom you could say that, and that experience of the austerity and the visual power of Mondrian's studio, not as just a place with some paintings, but as this enveloping environment with these rectangles of colored and gray and white paper arranged on the walls, which created this sense of a dynamic environment. I mean, that's the thing Calder always talked about. But other people suggested that his marriage to Louisa James, which somewhat settled his financial situation because she had a monthly check from her family, which some people have argued, well, that liberated him from doing these extraordinary representations of acrobats and Josephine Baker and political figures that he did in the late 1920s, that he could somehow do whatever he wanted, then he did abstraction. And there may be elements of truth in that, and I think also Louisa James was she was this person of a kind of more contemplative temperament than Calder's, which may have led him to the more, I would say, contemplative spirit of his early abstractions, which are among the most austere abstract works done anywhere in the world in the early 30s. But the other thing that suddenly dawned on me as I'm thinking about all of this is, my God, 1930, the Depression. And Calder in the late 20s is one of the great chroniclers, the great visual chronicler, I would say, of the spirit of the 20s, the time of the Charleston and the Josephine Bakers, these wild representations of this great African-American dancer, a triumph in Paris. these are among the great images of that moment, the kind of desperate, joyful champagne high of that moment. Calder was too profound a man to go on doing that in 1931 and 32. And the austerity of his first abstractions, which then Virgil Thomson associates with the death of Socrates 6 years later, that turn to abstraction, I think, is among many other things, a response to the moment. Not a kind of dumb, politically correct response, thank God, but the response of a profoundly feeling, thinking individual to a world that has changed. Now, Tom Wolfe wouldn't understand it because for him, you've got to be screaming about the workers, the workers, the workers, which is fine if you have something to say about it. But Wolfe wouldn't understand that for Calder, it was a turn to a kind of inward contemplativeness and in a way also a thought, as you always talk about the large forces that control the universe.
Well, let's take some questions.
Yes, let's take some questions.
Right there in the middle. That was the first one.
Thank you for your talk. It's so fascinating. I'm also fascinated by the title, The Conquest of Time. So I would really appreciate you elaborating on that part.
Well, Calder is the great kinetic sculptor of the 20th century. When Calder was beginning to move into the kinetic in the later 20s and 30s, one of the great discussions in the sort of circles, bohemian circles he moved in Europe, was about dimensions beyond the third dimension. His friend Duchamp was very interested in dimensions beyond the third dimension. And many people talked about the fourth dimension. Some people thought the fourth dimension was another dimension of space, but some people thought the fourth dimension was time. And I feel fairly confident, although Calder didn't directly really say this much, though I think he said it to people who were close to him who wrote about it. I think he saw moving into the kinetic as conquering this fourth dimension of time. So this volume is about the conquest of time. And volume 2 is going to be called The Conquest of Space because it's beginning in the 1960s that Calder fulfills another great dream of his, which was to do enormous monumental abstract sculptures. People think, now it's like you walk by a giant abstract sculpture, think, oh, another giant abstract sculpture. Oh, how boring. People don't realize that in the 1960s, there was an international battle to permit large-scale abstract sculpture in Europe, America, Canada, Central and South America. And Calder was far from being some fuddy-duddy establishment abstract artist, was a man at the forefront of this. And there are stories coming in volume 2 about the battle for big abstract sculpture that shock people because everybody thinks it's like, oh, that's nothing. It was a very big deal.
Over here, she's been waiting.
Thank you.
Do you have a question?
Yes, thank you. I have a question for Mr. Perl and for Mr. Rohr. For Mr. Rohr, if I'm pronouncing your name correctly.
Fairly good.
Fairly good, you said? Wait, jump in.
Rower's good.
Yeah, Rohr. And in any event, you talked about how 15 biographer wannabes auditioned, so to speak, and were found wanting. Did you consider going out before Mr. Perl came on the scene, or even going out to him, initiating a biography from the foundation? And for Mr. Perl, I wanted to know, and I would like to just add before I ask the question, I thrill at seeing large-scale abstract sculpture today, especially out in public. It brightens my day. You said that you had certain theories that were speculative, and some of them you thought were maybe about to go off the cliff. Could you bring up one or two that didn't quite make the grade for you?
You want to go first?
You go first. I have to try to think.
Well, let's see. No is the answer to your question. Do you remember her question for me? Okay. So the answer was no. We didn't go out and initiate. I thought about it. I thought about talking to John Russell. Remember that guy?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're lucky you didn't. Have you read his book about?
The Duchamp one?
No.
But, not Duchamp.
You're good.
Yeah. Anyway, I didn't go talk to John Russell.
John Russell's a wonderful writer in the English manner.
Yes. Yes. I would think about it occasionally. Who could write a good biography in amongst all the 35 other projects we were working on, and it never was the thing that floated to the top. One of my secrets to success has been to allow the universe to provide, literally. So when he walked in the door, finally, after a few decades of hard work, he showed up, and it seemed like a right fit at the right moment, everything was right. The stars had aligned. But I had thought about other people before, and no one really just seemed to be the right person. Your turn.
One question which I still feel a little frustrated about is Calder and Brancusi. Okay, we know Calder visited Brancusi a little bit in Paris. Everybody visited Brancusi. Calder's then close friend Noguchi had, of course, worked for Brancusi. And I didn't find a way in Volume 1 to really kind of think about Calder in relation to Brancusi. I actually think I may have a way in Volume 2 to do that. One of the nice things, frankly, about having a second volume, which I now have time, there is a draft of Volume 2, but a time to really revisit, is some of the things that I don't feel kind of, I fully grasped, maybe can be done better in Volume 2, because I would have loved there to be more of a story of Brancusi and Calder in a way, and there just isn't that much. He mentions, I think the only documentary thing we have is, I think actually in a letter to Noguchi, Calder kind of mentions something about Brancusi. I saw him, I was at the studio or something, and he's okay or something. So there are things that you would like to be able to bring together closer, and you can't. You can't bring them together narratively closer. It may be that at a later date in the book, when I could talk about it as a question of kind of formal influence. There's a period in the 40s where Calder works in wood a lot. And I've been thinking, this will be in Volume 2, and I've been thinking, and this is where during the war, really, when he's isolated from Europe. And I think that some of this working in wood is a way of thinking about the great abstract wood sculptors who he knew, which would be Brancusi and Arp. So I think there may be a way to get at, but it is, or for instance, Calder and Gertrude Stein. We know they had a meeting. Calder wanted, I think he went to tea at the Stein-Toklas house. He wanted them to come to his house on the Rue de Laconie and look at work. We don't know if they ever did. So again, tantalizing, how close can we get? So that kind of thing. And sometimes you just have to say, you have to kind of, you go down a rabbit hole and then you kind of say, I can't get any further with it. Some of that stuff, there's certain stuff that ends up in long endnotes in this book where I feel like I found some interesting information, but it just kind of stops you in the text. It's not meaty enough. And some of that stuff actually you can find in long endnotes, where it's just where they're there for another scholar who maybe can figure out another way to get at something.
And I should just add to that the Calder Foundation continues to develop our archive. We acquire materials all the time. In fact, I got a letter 2 days ago, which is written right after the Percier show. I haven't shown you this letter. It's written to this nice lady, this collector, this Miss Winston, where he says that his show is closed and she's missed it and she can't see it, but he's planning on painting a room in the house and installing the show again in his house on the Rue de la Colonie and having people come visit and see the show again.
Well, that's interesting because he also says in a letter to his parents, he talks about having an exhibition space for artists' friends in that house, which I don't think we know if that ever came to fruition. So again, and now maybe there was something like that. I mean, also part of the problem with, as we all know, is, when he's in Paris on the Rue de la Colonie, a lot of these people who are involved in this vanguard abstract movement are seeing each other probably every day. So it's conceivable that certain things could happen and there wouldn't be letters right? Because they don't need letters, you know? So a lot of the information comes from like a letter to his parents in America about, oh, I'm doing this. So yeah, sometimes that's the
Or
kind of thing.
journal, some of those journal entries you found.
Would-
It's these wild journal entries where somebody writes down they visited Calder and something happened.
Right,
and
we
this
find, yeah, I mean, you find one of the things I would do is go to other archives and find triangulations. I mean, there are some dates early in his career that actually were clarified because I went and looked at John Sloan. John Sloan was a friend of Calder's parents, who were both artists. And there was a whole question of when the Calder family came back from California in 1909 or 10. And this is actually a date that Calder got wrong in the autobiography, where he doesn't get many things wrong. But we have in John Sloan's diaries, Calder's father, who was a sculptor, Sterling Calder, is back in New York on this date, and he comes to see me. So that's the kind of thing that I've actually brought stuff. I mean, we've kind of, after a certain point, had a kind of collaborative thing going.
This handsome man.
Are there parts of his personality that evolved in your thinking that you finished up when we started the project and we ended the project with a sort of a very different man? I'm not talking about the work, I'm talking about the man.
Well, I mean, the whole question of his erotic life before he marries Louisa, I would say I did have an evolution about, because, and I actually now think that Louisa probably was more experienced sexually before she met him than people have thought.
Oh my God.
Yeah, I mean, but these were,
You just,
I mean, and I mean, you know, some of you have seen that, you remember the Warren Beatty movie Reds, which came out, I don't know, decades ago, and in that movie, there are witnesses to the period of the Russian Revolution. Rebecca West is in that movie. Henry Miller, the novelist, is in that movie. And Henry Miller is interviewed about sex. And Henry Miller says, you know, we fucked a lot back then, but we just didn't talk about it all the time, the way people do now, okay? And somebody mentioned this to me as well. I was struggling with this whole question of, Calder is in his early 30s when he marries Louisa, and there are these kind of passionate friendships we know about with various women, generally creatively inclined women. They're women who are like on the go and doing things in the world, and he's involved with them, and he'll do wire portraits of them or give them jewelry, in some cases rather erotically suggestive. And I began to realize that when he and Louisa married, and they were very open physically in many ways. They were famous for their great dancing parties in Connecticut, but they were also very discreet. They were like, it's our business what goes on in our bedroom. And I think they had this attitude, it's our business what we did before. And I think their friends were that way. So I began to heat up a bit some of these narratives about these friendships with a woman named Babe Hawes, who was a fashion designer, and a woman named Marion Greenwood, who we know was a girlfriend of Noguchi's, but I think before Noguchi may have actually been a girlfriend of Calder's now.
wasn't Noguchi the boyfriend of her husband too?
Noguchi, I don't think, well, anyway. And even Betty Salemi, I don't, you know. So that was something where I went through an evolution, and I had to be very careful. And then, in fact, there was a crazy thing where a friend of mine and my wife, very good friend of ours, who lives has a house in Woodstock, emails me once. She's talking to somebody, sort of our age, whose aunt was this woman, Marion Greenwood, who makes. He says to our friend, "Well, my aunt had an affair with Calder." Really? Wow. And like I started to go crazy. And then he denies it a day or two later in an email to me. No, I didn't actually say that. But this sort of is probably the way his aunt was about it. That she was, even if she did actually sleep with Calder. So that's a particular case of something. Or also, you know, there are cases of people finding Calder very, a lot of people didn't like Alexander Calder. This is little understood. People got really pissed off by him. People thought he was an operator and an opportunist. Some people thought that. Okay, and this is an interesting question.
Well, and they thought his sculpture wasn't sculpture too.
Yeah, but even people who thought it was sculpture thought he had it too easy. I mean, for instance, this is for volume 2, but he was friends with Arshil Gorky up in Connecticut in the years when Gorky's world is coming apart, and Gorky ends up committing suicide, and is found by close friends of Calder's. Gorky found Calder very hard to deal with, because here's Arshil Gorky, like, depressed out of his mind, going over to the Calder house, and Calder's like, let's have something to drink, and how did your work go today? And Gorky found it unbearable, because Calder was an optimist, and he was like, let's get on with it. So then what do you say about that when you're telling the story? I want to be true to what Gorky felt, but I don't think Calder was a trivial man, and I don't think he was somebody who trampled on other people to get ahead. So, so that becomes a delicate, it's sort of like if you had a friend, if you have a good friend who other good friend doesn't like, we've all had this experience. How do you what do you do with that? And your good friend saying, I really can't stand so-and-so. Why are you such good friends with them? That's somehow I sometimes feel.
All right, more questions, come on.
Sorry, Abigail.
Thank you, Jed. What an accomplishment.
Thank you.
There are so many aha moments in this book, but one in particular, I was wondering about what Noguchi said about the circus, and maybe you have something to add to this as well. How he said that it was a mixture of sadness and humor, and I wonder if you could comment on that, the sadness part in particular.
Well, I mean, puppets, little figures, little human beings, okay, looking at our whole world on a little scale, and that's what the circus was. And then this giant man, Calder, reaches down and folds up the little people and puts them away. Okay? I mean, it gets to the to Shakespeare's things about, the whole world is a stage, and, life is but a whatever, it's brief moment. I mean, I think Noguchi sensed that, to say the circus was about man's fate is to make it sound rather grandiose, though the French write things like that about the circus. I mean, somebody on a trapeze or somebody on the high wire, I mean, you're risking your life, right? For beauty or for elegance. These things are difficult, and a clown, clowns. It's a cliche, the sad clown, but there's truth to these things. So I think Noguchi recognized this element of the circus, and one of the things people forget about the circus, which has been at the Whitney Museum for it's almost half a century now, right? Yeah. The circus was not meant to be seen sitting static in a museum. The only way people saw the circus until the 1960s was when Calder took all these people out of these suitcases in which they were imprisoned and allowed them to do their thing for an hour or two. So this, the sense of the limits of human possibility, all those kind of ideas, I think, people sensed at the time. And one of the interesting things about this comment of Noguchi's about the sadness of the circus, which was solicited by Gene Lippman for the catalog of the great 1976 show at the Whitney, which was up when Calder died in New York. One of the fascinating things about it was that Gene Lippman took out that comment about the sadness of the circus in the catalog. And I think there you have, I mean, this goes to your whole struggle to rethink Calder as, in a way, the man many of his contemporaries understood him to be, which was a man of...
Well, there was this whitewashing of him for decades
right.
to take out the sad part because,
Right. And again,
But I was just told we either have 5 more questions or 5 more minutes. I think it was 5 more minutes, yeah. So 2 more questions. There's one over there.
You touched on this a drop, but the autobiography has always been one of my favorite autobiographies written by an artist. But in the process of doing this book, have you found that it's all bogus, or what have you found?
No, it is actually extraordinarily accurate. It is almost miraculously accurate. And the way it was done was in the early afternoon. Calder's living much of the year at the 60s in a town a couple of hours from Paris, Sachet in the Touraine. And his older daughter, Sandra Davidson, who's, I have to say, been an incredibly important collaborator on this book. I couldn't have done it without Sandra. Was living with her husband, John Davidson, who was a journalist, okay? So somebody practiced in listening to people and taking things down. They would have conversations, and Jean would go and write it all down. And it is absolutely extraordinary how, with limited documents, that he got so many things right. The interesting thing about the autobiography, I would say, from my point of view as a biographer, is sometimes I feel like he tells shaggy dog stories. Sometimes I feel like I desperately want him to talk about something, and the screen goes up, and he's not going to discuss that, okay? And I don't think this is out of, I mean, some people almost, somebody's talking about Calder as if he was sort of this abuser, he was almost a Philistine. But I actually think it's the reverse, that sometimes when it comes to the real mysteries of abstract art and the nature of abstract art, he's sort of saying, you know, I'm writing this story of my life, and frankly, I can't explain it this way. You know, one of the things that fascinates me about Calder, this man people say was unserious, when asked, you know, are you ever like stuck in your work? You know, what do you do when you're stuck? He said, well, when I'm stuck, I read what Jean-Paul Sartre wrote about me. And Jean-Paul Sartre's little essay about Calder is one of the greatest pieces of writing and most profound pieces of writing written about a 20th century writer, about a 20th century artist, period. So that's Calder. So, and at times in the autobiography, I think he's not going to go there. If we want to go there, that's fine, and I've tried to in certain cases. But the autobiography is extraordinary. It's beautifully written. It has a prose style. It's vivid, and almost line by line, it's accurate, which is extraordinary.
Another question?
One more.
Last question? Senor?
What did you learn that was most surprising to you in the book? Not an individual fact.
You know, what was the real revelation for me about this book is, well, it's a two-part answer, really. It's also my gratification of this first volume, which is the fact that it ends in 1940. Now, pretty much everybody who goes to buy a biography on Alexander Calder is thinking it's beginning in 1940. So that you've written about where Calder comes from. No one's ever done that before. Or if they've done it before, they read a few paragraphs about the father, the sculptor, and the mother, the painter, and the grandfather, the sculptor, and the 10 generations before of Alexander Calder's who were stonemasons back in Scotland, and just sort of a brief, glib, nonsensical thing. So Jed actually did research. So I learned so much about my family, and the not just the aesthetic sources of Calder, the sculptor, but who these people were and what their frustrations and desires were, and so forth. So if you think about Calder's father, who was this classical sculptor, and if you look at his sculpture today, it seems sort of academic and old-fashioned, but Jed's put it in the context of what was going on in 1900, what was going on in 1910, 1920, when Alexander Sterling Calder was a very famous artist. And then you start to open your eyes and get an education about who that guy is. And I've been looking at his work, I've been studying his work, my great-grandfather's work, and discovering a lot more about it because I'm more open to it. So the first volume sets the stage for volume 2, which is an extraordinary achievement. Because I was sort of thinking, I only care about volume 1, because volume 1 is when Calder develops all of his super end-degree genius ideas. The whole vocabulary is set by the time 1940 rolls around, because he's already invented this concept of monumental sculpture, making them from maquettes and industrial, scenarios and so on. All that stuff is really, it's already set. But now I'm super excited about volume 2. I'm really, and I'm going to keep his feet to the fire, so don't worry, to make sure that it's just as strong as volume 1.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you.